What's up? Welcome back to the James Kennedy podcast. I hope you're all good. You know, when I started this podcast, I didn't think I was going to make it past episode 3. I thought it was just going to be me talking rubbish about what I've been up to with my week. And yet here we are approaching 25 episodes, and we've had some absolute giants on the show. It's crazy. We've had a guest every single week. The podcast is still going, and it's becoming more and more commonplace now for people to come up to me, out and about and say how much they're enjoying the podcast and, their favorite episodes and things like that. So people are clearly starting to listen to the thing, which is cool. I didn't think anybody was listening. And it's made me wonder whether I need to start up my game on the production side of things. We don't have any intro music, no fun and games, no listener questions or anything like that. We can do some of that stuff if you want, but I kind of like the DIY punk rock aesthetic to the thing of just an unedited, unfiltered chat with super interesting people. No frills, no fireworks, just interesting information from interesting dudes. And speaking of interesting dudes, today's guest is an actual member of parliament. That's right, this person has actually shared the same air as Priti Patel. So this is going to be an interesting chat, and I'm really chuffed that I've managed to get their time today. So hang fire for what's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm going to quickly do the preamble that I always do before we get started. Have you subscribed to the podcast? Have you hit the rating button? Have you left a review? If you haven't, stop being a freeloading jackass and get on it. This is free content, man. Come on, help a brother out. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about the value of content in today's conversation, because today's guest is a strident supporter of the creative industries from within inside the walls of Parliament. And there's a whole host of things that I want to get into with them. So let's unveil the guest for today's episode. Kevin Brennan is the Labour MP for Cardiff West and a member of the Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. He is a staunch supporter of the campaign for fairer remuneration for musicians in the streaming age and fights many causes for the creative industries from within Parliament. He is also an active musician himself, so we've got loads to talk about, so let's get into it. And welcome onto the show, Mr. Kevin Brennan. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you.
Glad to hear it, and thanks for being with us. As I said, you are a consistent campaigner for the causes of the musical community, and we thank you for that. So I wanted to start by asking you, as someone who has a heightened understanding of these issues, as well as, the regulatory back end of them, what do you personally see as the main issues facing the music industry, or more specifically, musicians and artists, and the creative industries more generally? What do you feel are our main challenges right now?
That they are industries, and that they employ people and make a large contribution to the UK's national income, a growing contribution, in fact. The creative industries have been the fastest growing part of the economy in recent years, and that needs to be recognised by policymakers and by government. But of course, recent years have, shown that they can be affected, as other industries can be, by all sorts of things, including the COVID pandemic. And that had a massive impact on the live music industry, as well as live theatre and other creative industries that depend on you being able to have an audience and perform live. And it really, I think, threw into relief in the music industry in particular the fact that a lot of people were not making much money at all from the recorded side of the industry. A lot of creators were finding that in this age of streaming, their income was pretty minuscule from the recording side. And live, the absence of live really threw that into relief. There are lots and lots of other issues affecting the creative industries. I mean, for example, Brexit has had a massive impact, again, on the ability of people to play live, to tour, to develop their acts, to do the research and development of the creative industries, which is to get out there and play and perform, and so on. Generally, incomes for creators are pretty low.
And I know that you have been very vocal on the issue of remuneration rates within the streaming industries. Could you tell us a bit more about where we're at with that and what your personal position is on that?
Yes, there's been a lot of debate about it in Parliament. I'm a member, as you mentioned in your introduction, of the Parliamentary Select Committee, which looks at culture and the creative industries. And we did an inquiry into the economics of music streaming, precisely because of what I just said about the way that musicians are finding they weren't getting much money out of it and were concerned about the earnings that they were getting. And that inquiry, which was pretty groundbreaking, actually produced a substantial report with a number of recommendations in it, including a recommendation, amongst others, that musicians ought to be guaranteed a payment when their music is streamed. That's something called equitable remuneration, similar to what happens if you get your record played on the radio. And that's something that you're entitled to under copyright law. And so as a result of that report, a number of things have happened. One is that the government set off a number of work streams within a part of the government known as the Intellectual Property Office, or the IPO, to look into things like creators' earnings, like the transparency of information that musicians get from their record companies and their publishers and so on. So there's a whole stream of work going on around that, like the kind of fairness of the sorts of contracts that you're expected to sign if you are involved in recorded music. And it also then triggered a report by the Competition and Markets Authority into the market itself and into the dominance of the recorded music market by three very large companies, namely Warner, Sony, and Universal, and whether or not that market was operating in a proper competitive way. Where we're at right now is that the Competition and Markets Authority have issued an interim report on that issue, which we might talk about during the podcast, and that there's a lot of ongoing work in the Intellectual Property Office, which people from the music industry, both on the creator side and on the business side, are discussing, and that is due. The government are due to give us an update. It's supposed to be in September, but at the moment, obviously, there's a lot of churn going on in government. That may affect the timing of that, but it's supposed to report back on where they're at with all that work in September. And I know the Select Committee will want to revisit where we are in the autumn and see exactly what's happened to our recommendations.
Well, that all sounds quite hopeful, actually. I mean, I was under the impression that this was an issue that had plateaued. I didn't think that there was a lot of traction within government on this. I thought it was kind of like a niche issue. I mean, with everything else the country has got going on right now, I can't imagine that this would be seen as a priority within government. But given what you've just described, it sounds as if this is actually a bit further down the line than I thought. So then, given that ultimately meaningful change with regards to remuneration rates is going to have to come from legislation, because these platforms like Spotify are only going to work within the regulations that are set. They're not going to up the pay for musicians voluntarily. So what needs to happen next with regards to that regulatory change, and how far away do you think we are from that?
Well, there is a process underway, so yes, that carries on. But you are right to point out, obviously, that we are facing huge, broader challenges, economically, as a country, as other countries are as well. And you can't ignore the weather. And there's an economic storm blowing in relation to the cost of living crisis that the country's facing. So that is going to dominate. I mean, I'm not pretending for 1 second that isn't. But there is a lot of work that is in train, if you like, within government. And so there's a process going on. Now, the rates that people get paid, they're not a sort of product of evolution or something, some kind of natural law or anything. They are determined by the way in which the industry is structured and the deals that have been made, for example, by the major record companies, who are also the major rights holders in relation to publishing and the songs as well. Because as many of your listeners may know, they're very large, big three, also, as well as owning the recordings, if you like. They also own a lot of the publishing, the money that goes to songwriters and composers from having written songs and music in the first place. And so at the outset of when streaming began, over a decade ago now, they negotiated deals that were favorable towards the recording side of the business, because that's more profitable for the record companies than the song publishing side. That's gradually under pressure, gradually changed a bit, and the songs started to get a bit better of a deal. But one of the questions of our report, really, and of this whole process is, has actually the value of the song been suppressed artificially by the record companies, because it's not in their interest necessarily for that to get a bigger share of the pie. Now, these things happen because the negotiations that are done by these big companies with the streaming services like Spotify and Deezer and so on. They aren't set in stone. So part of the Competition Authority's inquiry was to look into that whole issue. What is going forward? I personally hope that what happens is that the industry comes to a much more sensible deal, with music makers as to what the share of each part should be from streaming. I proposed a bill in Parliament which would have changed copyright law to ensure that happens. That bill wasn't successful; it ran out of time. But the government's made it clear that if it had to, it would be prepared to legislate if it thought the industry wasn't making any of the changes it needed to make itself.
Well, for fear of repeating myself, this does all sound quite hopeful, actually. I'm quite surprised. I mean, I can understand why this is an issue that's close to your heart as a fellow musician. But are you seeing that echoed amongst your fellow MPs, particularly, across party? And do you feel that this is an issue that is actually understood and taken seriously within Parliament?
I mean, look, the music industry is a complicated industry. It's one of the reasons I think why sometimes it doesn't get all of the scrutiny it should be getting. And it isn't always understood by people in politics, just how significant it is in terms of its economic contribution and the number of jobs that it generates. So, traditionally, the creative industries have sometimes been viewed a little bit as Cinderella industries,
right?
Because you're not manufacturing hard bits of metal, unless it's heavy metal music.
I was going to say.
You're not actually banging out widgets and things like that.
Yeah.
So as a country that has a tradition of manufacturing industry, it's understandable that is the case, and manufacturing industry is very important. But we are actually very successful in our creative industries. We're one of the very small number of countries in the world that are net exporters of music, i.e. we earn more foreign currency from our music industry than we actually pay out from our music industry. Most countries are net importers, if you like, of music in that sense. And so we should be trying to maximize the comparative advantage we have. And in the long term, that comparative advantage is underpinned by our great creators, our musicians, artists, songwriters and composers and so on. And unless we have the right structure for them to be rewarded into the long term, then we'll lose that comparative advantage. And there are some unbuilt things about them, the sort of ecology, if you like, of music streaming, that mean that our creators into the future, musicians, are likely to see a decline in their income rather than a growth in it, despite our success in this area. Just to give you one example, gradually there's a trend for streaming services to take over from radio. There's a declining trend in radio and an increasing trend in streaming as a way of consuming music. And a lot of that consumption of music through streaming is not by a selection by the listener of wanting to listen to a particular song or album. It's because the streaming service will play out an algorithm of music it thinks you might be interested in.
Right.
So you're a passive listener. And in that way, you're a passive listener in a way that you might be if you tuned into a radio station, if you tuned in Jazz FM or Classic FM or Radio 1 or whatever it is. And if you were doing that, then musicians get this guaranteed payment when your music is played on the radio, called equitable remuneration. But if it's streamed in the way I've just described, they don't. And of course, over time, if streaming services gradually replace radio, then obviously that income will gradually be lost to musicians. So unless we do something about some of these things, we are undercutting our own advantage in music. And ultimately, that's shooting ourselves in the foot.
Well, this is something that we've talked about a few times on this podcast with previous guests. It is, on the subject of music, is just how insane the cultural global footprint of the UK's music output is on the world. For a tiny little island, our musical footprint on the world is massive. You know what I mean? It's the one thing that we do better than anywhere, I think. But I know that for certain politicians, that musical aspect is not going to be the primary concern for them. They need to know that the economics add up, which, as we all know, and as you outlined already, they certainly do. So I'd be keen to find out what some of the other findings were from this interim report that you mentioned earlier that we could come back to. What were some of the key elements from that report?
Well, I think that's one area where we might be a little bit disappointed, actually. And I think people from the campaigns have been disappointed by the Competition and Market Authority's assessment because they seem to have swallowed the analysis of the large record companies rather than listened hard enough to what's being said to them, by the musicians and songwriters and composers who have been giving evidence to them. Now, I've met with them, and I'll be putting further submissions in. This is an interim report, but it seems to me that what they've missed is that what you have here, in a way, in music, is not that dissimilar to an issue that came up about a decade ago regarding supermarkets. You've got a big you've got supermarkets who are big, businesses, and you've got small suppliers who are supplying them, with milk or whatever it is in terms of small farmers, etc., as well as some larger ones. And at the end of the day, you've got consumers who are probably getting, a good price out of that, in the sense that the supermarket prices are pretty reasonable before the current cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
That is.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was the situation I'm just talking about over a decade ago. But what the Competition and Markets Authority recognised then is that in that equation, what you have is a very large number of small businesses, which is what musicians are, small, businesses who are trying to make a living through their individual, endeavor at quite a small scale often. A large number of small businesses who are dealing with these very large companies who have a lot of market power over them, and therefore can, draw them into arrangements that are not fair in terms of the balance of power between the small businesses and the large ones. Now, the Competition and Markets Authority exists to make sure there's, good competitive markets and fairness within markets. And in the case of the supermarkets back then, they recommended to government that there should be a code of practice brought in the way that these large businesses, the supermarkets, deal with the small suppliers, and that there should be an independent adjudicator, a kind of ombudsman, if you like, who makes sure that that code of practice is enforced and is being followed by the big supermarkets. Now, it seems to me there's a strong analogy with what's going on in the music industry here, in that the big businesses control really the way that the money is divided up and distributed from the streaming services, because they own all the rights, or the vast majority of the rights, and they have the ability, therefore, to say to streaming services, this is the terms on which we're going to allow you to use our catalogs. And at the end product, the little supplier at the end, the musicians and so on, who for the most part are small businesses. We all know the famous exceptions to that, but that's not what we're really talking about here.
No.
I get in a raw deal. And I'm not saying that everybody, whoever puts a song up on Spotify, can make a living out of it, because they can't. The vast majority can't. But those people who are credible artists with a following, who definitely ought to be able to make at least some part of their living from their recorded music, the system's not working for them.
Well, Tom Gray was on the podcast a few episodes back, and he was explaining to us how basically the streaming model, the remuneration model of the streaming systems, is basically just built upon the major label model of yesteryear, on the bad old days. These aren't disruptive tech companies who are reshaping the landscape of the arts. They are actually building their castles on the bones of the pre-existing, grossly unfair major label model. So who do you personally see as the main obstacles here? Is it, the major labels? Is it these tech companies? Or is it a conglomeration of the both?
Yeah, well, it is the impact of both. And Tom's absolutely right, of course. You've got this effectively analog structure, from the old world, of the old customs and practices of the music businesses, of the music business, which are notorious even back then, back in the 60s, the business was largely run by gangsters.
Yeah.
But the fact is, this whole system was kind of based on the assumptions of the old world, i.e., that you had record companies with big underlying fixed costs, like distribution. You had to have loads of lorries and
Yeah.
trains and planes to get the records out to the record shops, and like the retail front end where you had to have high street shops in order to do it, manufacturing plants to manufacture albums and CDs and so on. Now, I know vinyl's making a comeback, but nevertheless, that is no longer the case for the vast majority of the way that people consume music, which is digitally. So all of those costs have gone from the industry. A lot of the A&R costs, in a way, have gone because of social media and TikTok and Spotify and Facebook and all the rest of it, because, before you even get anyway, you're rarely discovered, by half a dozen people in a club like Oasis were. These days you're actually already got a significant following. So you do your own A&R in a sense, because you've got a significant following already, probably on social media, before you're going to get signed by a company. So lots of those, former costs have fallen away, but the industry's behaving as if they're still there and still taking the same cut, or a very similar cut, as they did previously, when in fact more of that money should be filtering down to artists. And in a case of legacy artists who might have signed a contract before streaming was even invented, they might be being held to terms in their recording contracts which assume all this extra money for manufacturing and so on, and therefore pay them a pretty low percentage royalty. So, and in many cases, I'm sure Tom told you, some people, are deemed never to have recouped on their original advance. So they're deemed never to have paid back the record company for what they were given as an advance in the first place.
Yeah.
And therefore receive next to nothing, or if anything at all, from their streaming. They probably might get something on the songwriting, but maybe nothing at all from the recording side. Even though their music is being streamed, by their fans. So that, if you like, is the way the industries continue to behave. Of course, what they've done then is the distribution part of it, i.e. the streaming platforms, now have arrangements with those big record companies for being able to distribute their whole catalog via those streaming platforms.
Yeah.
Now, those businesses are not profitable in the sense they don't report profits, but they are generating huge revenues. I mean, Daniel Ek just recently spent millions and millions of pounds on sponsoring Barcelona Football Club's shirt. I don't think the executives who are paying themselves vast fortunes in those companies are too worried at this point about whether they're profitable, since their aim is simply world domination at this point rather than profitability. So all in all, you've got there a structure that suits everybody except the musicians, the actual people who are the source, if you like, of the product that these people are distributing and selling to listeners, and that's wrong.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. So, as you said, this is likely to be, despite the progress made on this is likely to be put on the back burner now, because we are entering some very volatile times economically and socially. What can people do who wants to get behind this? Because music it's an essential element in everybody's life, isn't it? There's no lack of support for artists and musicians out there on the streets. So what can people do to support their favorite artists or emerging independent bands over the next however long it's going to take before there start to be some rumbles of systemic change on this issue?
Well, look, I wouldn't give up on systemic change, although there's lots of other things happening. The business of government does go on, and we have to keep pressing the campaign, because this is a long-term reform that we're looking for. So it just because the economic weather is absolutely terrible at the moment, it doesn't mean it's still not the right thing to pursue and to do. So I'd say that first of all, and things only change if people get together and campaign for it. So we should keep going and not put your head in your hands about the situation. And as I say, there are a number of bits of work going on that are due to report in the coming months. So it's a very, very active situation at the moment. For individuals, there's a number of things that people can do. Obviously, keep supporting music for a start. Keep attending and go into live music, because for a lot of musicians, that's the only way that they'll make their money. Do buy their physical product from them directly as well, or through Bandcamp and other interfaces like that, because often, smaller musicians will make more money from selling a few records than they will by streaming,
Yeah.
millions of millions of streams on Spotify.
Yeah.
So, do continue doing things like that, and do actively get involved in campaigns and raise your voice about this. I think that that ultimately people really do care about music, and but we need to reestablish that connection between the musicians that they love and the people who listen to their music. And one of the unfortunate side effects, I think, of the whole streaming ecology is the way that it breaks down the direct relationship between the fan and the musician.
Yeah.
So lots of people don't understand that you might pay your £10 a month to Spotify because you want to listen, when you can, when you're out of your work environment or whatever, to an artist that you love, whether it's Ms. A Nobody, whoever it is. But you might listen only to Ms. A Nobody. But your £10 is not going to go to the person you listen to,
No.
the person you pay money to listen to. It's going to go to somebody whose music is, being streamed millions and millions of times by other people who might have their music on all day because they're able to do that in whatever it is. So, in other words, there's no connection between direct connection with the fan and the music they're listening to through the economics of music streaming. It's something I think that some people like SoundCloud, for example, are experimenting with trying to change that. But as fans, I think we ought to be, and as consumers, we ought to be saying, actually, we want our money to go to the musicians that we like to listen to, and to advocate for that and speak up for it.
Well, that's the difference between the pro rata system, isn't it, and the user-centric or the fan-centric system.
It is.
Whereby...
It isn't the answer to everything, but it is important, I think, that connection is reestablished between the music we listen to and the people who make it and the people who listen to it. And it has been broken down, I think, in recent years, partly by the way that the digital economy works in streaming, and it doesn't have to work that way forever.
No, I think it's crazy, and I think it's a really important issue. I mean, if I pay my $9.99 a month for Spotify and all I listen to is Swedish death metal, they're not getting any of the money that I pay every month, even though that's all I'm listening to. I mean, the way that it works for listeners that don't understand is that all of the subscription money gets put into one big pot and then divvied up amongst the biggest streamed artists, such as Ed Sheeran or Drake or whoever. They're getting all of the money that is paid by listeners who may only be listening to Swedish death metal, who don't even listen to music made by the 1%. So
that's right. Your £10, the government will take its cut first of all, inevitably. We've got to pay our taxes. Then the streaming service will get its cut, i.e. Spotify or Deezer or whoever, Apple Music. Then the publishing company will get a bit, and then the record company will get a chunk, and the publishers and record company will pay whatever percentage it is they have to pay out ultimately to the musician. In the case of publishing, obviously you get a bigger percentage going to the musician than you do from a record deal. Yeah. Hence the reason why, in my view, the system is skewed towards the record deal rather than towards the songwriting and composing side. And plus, obviously, as part of that, the big chunk of it will go to the record company. So that's how the economics of it works. But it isn't going that bit that goes to musicians to who you listen to. It's just put into a pool and divided up according to the number of streams.
Yes.
Which, in a way, that's a weird way of defining it, isn't it? If this is supposed to be, which is what the record labels argue, the equivalent of what of you buying a record in the past, because that's the argument they make to justify the system that they use. If it's supposed to be that, well, if you bought a record and you took it home and you played it all day, the artist is not going to get any more money because you played that record all day at home. The artist is actually only going to get what you you paid for their share of what you paid for the record. So you might be a connoisseur of music and buy every record by that particular artist. But under this system, they don't get the rewards. And it just shows, I think, this is a new type of way of consuming music. It does have elements of being a bit like buying a record, but it also has elements of being a bit like passively listening to the radio.
Yeah.
And that's why there needs to be a different way of rewarding artists to make sure that people are getting fairly paid that reflects the reality of that new technology.
Do you think that streaming is here to stay, or do you see there being another shift to come?
Well, if I, knew what was going to come next, then obviously I could put my meager savings into
investing in it.
And I do read the music press and look at forward trends and so on. And there are various, predictions that people make. And in fairness, I think people deserve reward for investing in new technology and so on. I'm absolutely not saying that isn't the case, but just as they deserve reward for investing in new music as well. But it would seem that that this technology, streaming technology, is certainly has become the dominant way that people consume music. But then, would we have anticipated? Did many people anticipate, 20 years ago, that it wouldn't be downloading where you actually, effectively, if not legally, effectively owned a track when you downloaded it from iTunes onto your iPod and so on? Would many people 20 years ago have said, actually, downloading as a technology will only last 10 years and will be pretty much completely replaced by streaming, where you don't own any tracks at all, you just listen to them from a catalog? So who knows what comes next? And there are all sorts of things about, what's the significance of the metaverse? What's the significance of the use of music in virtual worlds and so on, where people's music is going to be being performed, where you can attend a virtual gig performed by avatars. We've seen a recent story about the music industry getting into trouble for artificial intelligence and music that is generated by algorithms and so on, and actually creating virtual artists. There are all sorts of things that could seem like a dystopian future that we might face. But in the meantime, I think we should fix what we have got and what is going to be the dominant technology for the foreseeable future to make sure that it rewards creators. Great point.
Yeah, well, it does sound as if, things are in movement on this issue, thanks to the tireless work of people such as yourself. So that does bode well for, the future. But I want to steer off topic a little bit whilst we're on the subject of what people can do to help, because I have a lot of campaign groups and charities on the podcast, and I always try to end our conversations with them with what can people do to help, and as well as supporting the charities and getting behind the campaigns. Every single time, the answer to that question from these campaigners is, what can people do to help, is to lobby your MP. So whilst I've got an actual MP on the call, I'm dying to ask whether you echo that as an effective means of change. As I can see it, you're only one person. So if you have, 100 different causes lobbied to you from your constituents, you can't represent all of them effectively. So is lobbying your MP the ultimate tool of the constituent with regards to change, or are these groups being naive to the power of that? What's your experience?
No, I don't think it's naive. I think it's important to do it, actually. And I can tell you that members of parliament, the thing that they listen to the most, you might think they only listen to big, powerful interests, and clearly, there are all sorts of people who are very powerful, often trying to lobby members of parliament about things, including the music industry. But unless the voice of the constituents are heard, then there's not enough incentive for them to do something about it. And the thing that MPs do listen to the most is individual lobbying from their constituents. Now, sometimes where campaigns go wrong, I think, and are not as effective, is if they sort of engage in what you might call a kind of clicktivism, if you like, where you say, here's an online letter, click it and send this link and send it to your MP. And then that member of parliament might get 100 identical emails, from
Right.
a campaign.
Right.
And that, if you imagine you're receiving that on the other end as a member of parliament, then your only way to respond to that really is to sort of come up with a stock answer and to
Right.
send it back. The answer to the constituents or whatever, or to post it on your website and so on. But if you're an individual constituent and you're a jobbing musician, you run a local venue, there's something like that where you're making a contribution in that person's constituency and you live there, and you approach your MP individually, either by writing to them by email or even by snail mail, still happens, or visiting their constituency surgery if they're able to hold one. Obviously, COVID has disrupted a lot of that process. Or and asking to meet them to discuss the issues and to explain your concerns, and asking them to do something like, will you write to the minister to say, please, can you make sure that the government does actually do something as it's promised to do in relation to improving creators' earnings from music streaming, etc. In other words, whenever the campaign, please can you support the campaign to get musicians to be able to tour more freely around Europe. And that sort of engagement actually does make a difference and engages the interest of members of parliament. And ultimately, we're all realistic. Lots of things that happen in Parliament are determined by, the way that the government decides to do things. They control a lot of the agenda and the votes in Parliament. But
Right.
the more you build up a body of MPs who take an interest in the subject of musicians and understand the contribution that the music industry and the other creative industries make in all of our constituencies, then the more likely it is that policymakers will take notice.
Well, that's great to hear, and thanks for answering that, because I know we're going off topic. But staying on that subject a second, do you feel that as well as the personal lobbying of one's representative, do you feel that as well as that, things such as protest and direct action and civil disobedience also influence you, or are they not as effective to that end as a direct reach out from one of your constituents?
Well, I mean, there's a very long and sort of noble history of protest in our country, and it's a vital part of any democracy. And sometimes that does include things like civil disobedience, etc. But I mean, around, I think, issues like music industry reform and so on, I think this is something that is best done through campaigning and raising voices and getting people to understand the importance of our creative industries and to up their profile and importance within government. Because, you've got a department like digital culture, media and sport. It's a hugely important chunk of our economy as well as of our culture. And yet it doesn't have enough heft, if you like, within government compared sometimes to other departments. So part of the work I do on the select committee is to try to, raise these sorts of issues up the agenda to get people to understand their importance. Clearly, people, will protest and take industrial action where things affect them directly, where they have the ability to do so, as we're seeing at the moment. And that, as I say, is also another part of our democracy. But I'm not advocating going around smashing anything up, by the way. But
damn it, just getting ready as well.
Certainly not. But definitely, obviously, we had a good protest outside Parliament, a sort of typical musicians' protest, playing music and drawing attention to ourselves. When my bill was underway, and it got the interest of a lot of MPs.
Right.
So I think one thing music's got going for it quite often, actually, is that many people, including politicians, are actually fans of music themselves. So that's something that can be leveraged to get their attention and get them to understand issues that affect musicians and other creators.
I'm just going to take a guess here, but I'm guessing that the music that's listened to by the party in blue there is probably exclusively made by people from 500 years ago. Am I right in that, or am I being unfairly prejudiced?
Probably a little bit, because I chair the All Party Parliamentary Group on music, which is a group of MPs from different parties who try to work together you often don't see that on Prime Minister's Questions or on Question Time on the telly or something. But there are that some of us do try to work together, understanding that sometimes behind the scenes you can achieve quite a lot by doing that. And there are conservative politicians who are big music fans and fans of more than just sort of
Beethoven, Bach.
old style music. Anything from heavy metal to sort of indie stuff, and or even hip hop, and so there are.
Wow.
I wouldn't seek to totally parody people, in that way.
Okay.
But obviously there is obviously a tendency for people who have a strong interest in the arts and so on, sometimes to take a more kind of liberal left wing view of society.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I also love the idea that, as you just described there, of Jacob Rees-Mogg listening to some hip-hop, but I'm guessing that's not who you're talking about. I want to stay off topic for just one more question before we loop back to talk about your band before the clock runs out here, because I'd be doing my fellow lefties a disservice by not asking you this whilst I have a Labour MP on the line. As we all know, the country is in a mess right now, worryingly so. We've got this crazy cost of living crisis, the fallout from Brexit. The price of energy is just disgraceful, and we've got a brutal winter coming up as well, which is going to exacerbate that. The NHS is struggling, workers' rights are being threatened. We've got the Police and Courts Bill coming through, which is going to make protesting about any of it essentially a criminal act. And the country appears to be being sold out from underneath us to the highest bidder. So my question is, where's the opposition? We need Labour more than ever right now, and I just don't feel like an effective opposition to the behemoth of Tory destruction has been there for us. And I myself left the party to join the Greens, and I know that many other former Labour members are angry and disappointed. So I would like to ask what your thoughts are on the current state of the Labour Party, and do you understand why people are feeling so let down by you guys right now?
I think, let me tell you, I've been both in government and in opposition, in my time in Parliament. And, one day in government is worth 1,000 days in opposition. The truth of the matter is that it's a bit like shouting into a vacuum sometimes being in opposition. And it's no good just making a noise, and it's no good just being a party of protest. You actually have to have, you have to be very, very serious about understanding that in order to win an election, which is what you have to do to really make any difference, that you've got to persuade people, who haven't previously voted for you, to vote for you. So I think, I think that it's quite easy sometimes to say you should be making more noise, should be more disruptive, and so on. I think what's needed most of all is for the Labour Party to provide a credible opposition that can look like and that people see as an alternative government. And with the mess that the current government's made and the mess that's going to be, left behind, that's going to be an extremely, difficult task. So I actually think we really need to focus in on trying to unify around getting rid of this current government because of the mess they're making of the country. And the more and more that we just simply are kind of, disunited about that, the more it will allow them to have yet another term in office. And that's always been the problem, I think, on the left side of politics. We tend to divide ourselves up into factions, whereas the Tories are focused on one thing and one thing alone, and that is power. And the reason they are so successful is because they do focus on what it takes to actually be in power and then to stay in power. And if we can't unite at the moment to say we have to get rid of this dreadful government which led us into this economic disaster and which is doing so much to ruin the country and disrupt our reputation across the world as well, then that would be a terrible indictment, a terrible failure. So I think we all need to just we can argue about various things, but if we can't focus on that, then I'm afraid we've got no chance.
Yeah, great point. Well argued, and thanks for answering that, because I know that wasn't really on the sort of topic list.
By the way, a lot of the proposals that I'm making are in the Labour, front bench policy book, and will, be things that we'd be proposing in our manifesto. So they're worth fighting for and worth voting for if you're interested in trying to bring about the sort of change for the creative industries and musicians that we're talking about.
Well, as I mentioned, I've now left the Labour Party. I'm now a member of the Green Party because of, like I said, because of the growing sense of disappointment.
Vote tactically for Labour in the general election. Unless you're, because otherwise you might let a Tory in. Depends where you live, obviously, but. Anyway.
Yeah, well, we had Owen Winter from the campaign group Make Votes Matter on a few episodes back talking about proportional representation. And obviously, unfortunately, until we get that, then, tactical voting really is our only option, isn't it? Because, as you say, the priority number one is to get the damn Tories out, by hook or by crook, so we could figure the rest out later on.
Well, I'd agree with you on proportional representation, but as you say, it's don't let perfection be the enemy of the good.
Love it. Right, well, before we quickly wrap up, I just want to ask you about your bands and your own music. So let's loop it back to music and tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I've always played music since I was a teenager and written songs and so on. So I've been actively playing music, all my life, and from time to time I played in bands and so on. But when I became an MP, last thing I expected happened was to end up playing in a rock band. But it turned out that we had some musicians in Parliament at that time in the early 2000s. One was Pete Wishart, who is the Scottish National Party member, but who played for 18 years in Runrig, who were a big Scottish band and were on top of the pops and played to 100,000 people at Loch Lomond and all that kind of thing. And another guy was a Labour MP called Ian Causey, who had played semi-pro all his life as a bass player, mainly in covers bands, but and then they were looking around and thinking we'll never find a drummer, and unbelievably they stumbled upon a guy called Greg Knight, who was a Conservative MP, but who played in a lot of soul bands in the 70s. And then I said, well, you can't just have keyboard, bass and drums. You've got to have guitar and vocals as well. So we ended up forming a band called MP4. And over the years, we've done a lot of gigs. We've been on TV, and we've raised quite a lot of money for charity and made a few records. And then just recently, on a personal basis, I actually finally got round to recording a solo album, which is out on Revolver Records. You'll be interested, your listeners might be interested to know, and it's available on all the streaming services, despite the lousy rate that they pay. And it's called The Clown and the Cigarette Girl, and under the name Kevin Brennan. And they're all my own compositions. And if you like a bit of kind of folky, rocky, Americana-y type of music, singer-songwriter-y stuff with an emphasis on narrative songwriting, that's what you'll find on my album. So give it a spin if you fancy.
Well, I have, and I can say, it's really, really good, man. I'd love to come and check you out if you're playing in the area sometime soon. You'll have to let me know.
Well, there are a limited amount of gigs I'm able to do, given the full-time job. But I did do one at the 100 Club earlier this year, which was fantastic. And I also did one in Cardiff to launch the vinyl version of the album, which was also great. And I was lucky enough to be able to recruit Glenn Matlock, i.e. formerly of the Sex Pistols, to play bass both on the album and live with me before he defected to Blondie, where he's currently on tour in the States playing with Blondie. So I may have lost his services, I think.
Well, I'm just in awe that you managed to do all this stuff, whilst, your full-time job as an MP and everything else that you're doing as well. You're putting me to shame, man. And on that note, I promised I wouldn't keep you past past. So the clock is getting on now. So Kevin, I'm going to bid you farewell and let you get on with the rest of your pressing affairs. Thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to chat with me today and to share all that info. And thanks so much for everything that you're doing inside and out of Parliament on this issue as well. The musical community thanks you, and we're rooting for your success.
It's been an extraordinary pleasure, James. Thanks for having me.
Oh, anytime, man. I look forward to coming out and catching one of your gigs.
Definitely. Keep going.
Cheers, Kevin.
Cheers.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Kevin Brennan, Member of Parliament for Cardiff West. And also, as we've just discovered, performing in a kick-ass rock band with a slamming solo career. So, definitely putting my lazy ass to shame. That was another chat that challenged quite a few of my preconceptions, which I always like to have done. And Kevin made some interesting points there towards the end about the nature of representation and democracy, which was off script, which was off topic. It's not what we'd arranged to talk about, so I appreciate him letting me take us into that territory. And I hope that gave an interesting insight, certainly into Kevin's experience as a member of parliament and what is the most effective means of lobbying somebody who's a member of parliament. Because that is something that gets discussed a lot on this podcast is, how do we affect change? I'm still not going to be making up with the Labour Party anytime soon because I am deeply disappointed in them. But I do understand Kevin's point about, they are unfortunately the only chance we've got of getting the Tories out. So, we may have to do what we've got to do in the next election. But I am deeply dissatisfied with the Labour Party, which is a shame because, that is traditionally the party that I would align myself with as a person on the traditional left. But that notwithstanding, Kevin in particular is, as a Labour MP, is doing amazing work on the issues of fair remuneration for musicians and, a whole host of other cultural concerns through the work that he does at the Select Committee. So, as I've grown to learn over the years after my 10 years in the dark abyss of complete cynicism, as I've grown to learn, they're not all the same. You can't say that about any group of people. You can't say it about any race or religion. You can't say it about protesters, and you can't say it about politicians. As much as I'd like to be able to tar them all with the same brush and say they're all the same, unfortunately, they're not all the same. It's not that simple. But, democracy isn't perfect. It's messy, it's slow, it's full of compromise. But at the moment, it's the best we've got, and we're lucky to have it because so many places around the world don't. So having Kevin confirm for us now that, yes, MPs do react to being lobbied by their constituents, I think we've all got an open door now to start making some noise with our representatives about whatever the issue may be that we're concerned about. So that's a great insight. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the chat as well about the music industry and the streaming models. And as Kevin said, the best way that you can continue to support your favorite artists between now and getting any kind of legislative change is to, get involved directly with the artists that you want to support. Get behind the crowdfunding campaigns. Buy some merch. Make a donation to their tip jar or whatever it might be. Musicians have gone from being shafted by the music industry to now being shafted by the music industry and the tech industry, so we keep doing what we're doing because we love it. That's the drug for us, is being able to share our passions with people that want to hear it. But at the end of the day, we've got to eat food in order to do that as well. You know what I mean? So if you're able, because I know times are hard for everybody right now, if you're able, there are so many ways that you can directly help to support the artists that you love. And the same goes for us lowly podcasters as well. We don't ask for much. All we ask is that you subscribe to our podcast, you click follow, you click the star rating, and you leave a review. Is that too much to ask? I mean, I don't think I've mentioned it before on this podcast, but I would love it if you subscribe to the James Kennedy podcast to get these, awesome episodes direct into your notification box every week so that you never miss an episode. And if you can give me a rating so that the algorithm starts to think there's something cool going on over here and suggests it to other people, and then we can spread the propaganda even further, then that would be awesome. So there's something you can do to support a humble artiste without even spending a shekel. We've got some insane guests coming up over the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for those. And in the meantime, as always, take care of yourself, take care of others, have an awesome week, and I'll see you next time, same place, same time. Love you loads.